Okay, so today's video is going to cover a wide range of topics. This is actually going to be my first video uploading to this channel. Future videos will be a little bit more topic-based, I assume. I guess we'll find out. Um, Ranging from topics under the theme of liberation to topics under the theme of literature. In my personal life, two things really dominate. I'm an English teacher in high school. I teach literature. And then the other thing is about 20 plus years of immersion in the path to awakening. And today's video is really about kind of clarifying what awakening is and what leads to awakening. There's a lot of misunderstanding that I've seen on YouTube, and I've been wasting my time on comment threads, and I thought to myself, why don't I just make a video and post it? So the Buddha's path to awakening is pretty much encapsulated within the teachings on the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are very unique compared to other teachings in other religions. In fact, if a mind is ready to wake up and see truth and be liberated from it, then the Four Noble Truths are the only thing you'll ever need to hear. As soon as you hear it and you see it, the mind will wake up. It's a little bit like when you're a child and you're laying in the dark and you think you see a monster in the corner. And then suddenly your dad comes in and turns the lights on and the monster disappears. Because at the moment those lights turn on, the monster is revealed to be a shadow cast by a coat rack in the corner. Well, where did the monster go? It didn't go anywhere. It was never there. It was just a perception based off of a lack of true knowledge, ignorance, which is sort of the root condition for what we call suffering, what we call confusion, pain, all the things that we who are on this path of seeking are trying to get away from. So we're kind of in this state of mental darkness. And because we're in this state of mental darkness, we misperceive the world, we misperceive nature, essentially. And in that misperception, create a world, and in that world, we create a self. In fact, the self arises and the world arises at the exact same time from the root of craving, which takes the form of greed, hatred, and delusion, or you could think of it more simply as attraction, aversion, and delusion, or attraction, aversion, and confusion. But the habitat for the arising of craving is ignorance, and ignorance in Buddhism is defined as not knowing the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are a deceptively simple teaching, but the Buddha, after his awakening and thinking about it, formulated his teaching into the Four Noble Truths because he was trying to avoid creating new concepts for people to objectify in their mind and thereby lust after. Other religions have positive images, concepts like God or pure awareness or the self or the Brahman or some kind of concept of an absolute. And even if we are to take these things to be true, as soon as the mind has a positive image and name, which the two together form a concept, it becomes an object that the mind has fabricated, and then that object of fabrication is then sought after. This is what we call spiritual materialism. The normal worldling, as the Buddha calls them, as the Buddha phrases it, the patujana, the person who lives in the world. Most of worldlings, most people who live in the world will say, live a life of materialism. We are raised in this condition of ignorance, and we each form different objects in our mind that represent happiness or satisfaction. So when I get that object, that idea, then I will be happy, right? We are little kids And we see this every day. Teachers enter lives. I'm a teacher, by the way, but not for kids. I'm a high school teacher, so I'm not being critical of teacher. We have our parents, we have our teachers who come to us and say, um, what's going on right now is great, but in the future, there will be this, right? What do you want to be in the future? Do you want to be an astronaut? Do you want to be a doctor? Do you want to, or they'll tell us what we should want. They'll tell us we should want to go to college. We should want to buy a house. We should want to have a fulfilling relationship. We watch movies that, show us people having shiny lives, and they're shiny and perfect because it's on a TV screen. It doesn't smell. It doesn't have a taste. It's in this perfect world behind a screen, right? Rom-coms, shows like Sex and the City, shows that, and movies that show a character living a life that has conflict, but ultimately the tension between the character and that society or that plot eventually lead to some kind of satisfying object of desire, and there it is. So all of us engage with the world in different ways, whether it's through television or just through our peers and our parents and our teachers and all the images we're surrounded by, advertisements. And these give birth to ideas in the mind, and these ideas collect into a storyline that we then lust after. And as soon as we acquire that object, the satisfaction we get from it very quickly dissolves into dissatisfaction, and we form a new object. So our whole life is characterized by the pursuit of material objects that we think are going to bring us some kind of permanent satisfaction. I can go on about this for hours, but those of us who consider ourselves seekers, we have an experience at some point where maybe somebody dies, or we experience a depression, or we have an insight about who we're going to be in our old age, like I did, right? I saw myself as an old man in my deathbed, looking back at the moment I was in, and that triggered one of my first insights. But we have some kind of experience, or we have an experience of a sudden awakening, and no matter how mild that sudden awakening is, actually, it feels extremely profound the first time it happens. It dissolves some kind of illusion, like that light that's turned on. That dissolves the illusion of the monster in the corner. Or the other example is you're walking down the road and you see a snake and fear arises. And then suddenly the snake becomes a rope as you get closer. Well, actually, was it a rope the whole time? But the second the knowledge of the rope arises, the perception or the misperception of snake dissolves, and the fear dependent on that perception, along with self that arose along with that fear, they all dissolve altogether. So that the second that true knowledge arises, everything that depended on ignorance dissolves. So in the case of the snake and the rope, not only does the snake vanish, but the fear and the me that was afraid vanishes along with it. So that illustrates a much larger process that we have in life. But for us who are drawn to the path of some kind of religion or any kind of path, contemplative path of awakening, after our first experience, that experience becomes a memory. That memory becomes a concept. We attach that concept to a religion or a path. It could be Buddhism. It could be Christianity. It could be anything. It could be Advaita Vedanta, anything. And we develop the seeker delusion that becomes what we call spiritual materialism. So then we have concepts like God. We have concepts like awakening, nibbana, nirvana. We have concepts like jhana, we have concepts like stream enterer. There's any number of concepts, as long as their concepts are objectified by the mind and then are sought after. And this is what we call spiritual materialism. And YouTube is full of it. The spiritual path is full of it. In fact, myself, I stopped doing sitting meditation years ago, even though I was getting great benefit from it. I still do it, but I started to do it less. And that was because I started to realize that every time I sat on the cushion, the self, the I who was seeking nirvana or nibbana in Theravada Buddhism would arise. And so that was its own self in the context of the meditation cushion. I call it samsara sitting on the cushion. And a lot of us experience this. In fact, it's kind of the saddest reality of the path of meditation is, as soon as we have a good experience in meditation, it becomes a concept. And then every time we sit on that cushion, the self who is in pursuit of that concept arises, and suffering arises along with it, because that's what dependent origination is. The core teaching of the Four Noble Truths is sort of a simplified version of dependent origination. So getting back to the Four Noble Truths, and why the Four Noble Truths is true knowledge, is that the Four Noble Truths is simply seeing the dissatisfaction, the dukkha, the discontent. In its essential meaning, it just means disturbance, which is a synonym for the Latin root of emotion. Dukkha is essentially disturbance. It's illustrated in the early texts as a wheel that doesn't quite fit its axle. So a wheel that doesn't quite fit its axle on a chariot is called dukkha, and it's just basically out of sync with the axle. It creates disharmony there, and that disharmony reverberates through the whole chariot, so you're just kind of like vibrating, right? So that's just an illustration of dukkha. So what creates this disharmony in the mind? I'm getting ahead of myself here, but it is the arising of I, along with the arising of me and mine. But that's at the end of the process. Going back a little further is the root of this I, which is craving, and craving takes the form of greed, hatred, and delusion. Going back further, as I said in the beginning, is the condition or the habitat for craving to arise of ignorance, and that's that mental darkness. See, craving is sort of like a fungus. It only grows in the dark, and it is dissolved in the light. Fungus can't live in the sunlight. It can only live below a certain temperature. I think it's 94 degrees Fahrenheit. So it grows in the dark and it grows in the wet. And that's where craving grows. It grows in the dark, wet environment of ignorance. And craving is the root of the I, me, and mine. So many people who claim to be awakened, I've noticed, have intellectually understood the fact that this mind is free of a self, an I, me, or a mine. This is actually quite easy to understand intellectually, and I can help you understand it right now. Our ancestors used to look at a storm and they would personify that storm. They would see an angry god in that storm. Basically, the storm was the result of a god becoming angry, right? This is something in all of our primitive roots. We used to look at the sky and the ground and everything around us, and we would personify it. The arising of true knowledge, in this example, scientific knowledge, we now know that a storm arises because of a combination of causes and conditions, right? Water vapor condenses. There's, certain friction that creates electricity. The difference between positive and negative ions in the sky and the ground create lightning. I'm not going to go into what causes a storm, but we know that clouds and rain and thunder and lightning are born of causes and conditions, elemental processes of nature. Now we know because of that, we cannot see a self, we cannot personify a storm anymore because we have this true knowledge of the conditions that give rise to a storm. That's external nature. More difficult to see is how that exact process of personification arises internally in the mind itself. So we personify our own mental and physical processes. The body is a physical, biological process. The mind is a nomenological process, you could say, phenomenological process. It's a mental process. The Buddha expresses this as form, feeling, perception or memory, thinking, and sensory consciousness. These are the elements of the body-mind complex. Each of them arises and passes away according to causes and conditions, exactly like that storm. And when we can see into that process, we can see that this body-mind here is empty of I, me, or mine. But And that's really helpful to understand that. And then you can experience it in deep meditation. When you look deeply into the mind, you can see through the process of I making, of mind making. You can see through it. And when the mind sees that, it lets go of a whole lot of suffering. But guess what? That I, me, mine is going to continue to re-arise. Why? Because it's not the actual phenomena. It is the shadow. It's an epiphenomena. So in the same way that a tree exists, but the shadow of a tree doesn't really exist, it's really just the epiphenomena of that tree. The I, me, and mine, the self, is the shadow of craving. Craving takes the form of greed, hatred, and delusion. So when you see people online claiming that the realization of non-self has led them to awakening, but you still see them exhibiting attraction, aversion, and delusion, mental proliferation, justification of various forms of craving, claiming that awakened people can still harm people. Well, that is true, actually. People who have awakened to the fictitious nature of the self and who have awakened to the fetter of attachment to rules and rituals can harm people, actually. Why? Because they still have the fetter of doubt. They don't see the Four Noble Truths. They still have craving, they still have attraction and aversion, and they still have the higher five fetters. But just those other ones I mentioned are enough that if you liberate yourself from the personality view, which is the first fetter, and you liberate yourself from attachment to rites and rituals, which is the second fetter, but you don't break the third fetter of doubt, and you don't break craving in the form of attraction and aversion, then the social fictions, the social conventions of self and rules and rituals and conventions that control human behavior are gone, but craving is still there. So of course, a person who has realized emptiness of self can still harm people. What they're really doing, first of all, is harming themselves because they think that they're enlightened, right? They're a tiny bit enlightened. It's very, a scientist, a doctor can see there's no self in the body. A neurologist can see, and an anesthesiologist can see that there's no self in the mind. And an academic, an intellectual, an everyday person can see the absence of self in the body-mind complex. Experiencing it is much more important. But as long as the fetter of doubt is still there, which is doubt about what leads out of suffering, or what is the cause of suffering, what suffering is, first of all, what is its cause, and what is the way out of suffering, the actual experience of fully understanding what suffering is, what dukkha is. That's the first noble truth. Really understanding and abandoning its cause, which is the second noble truth. Realizing its absence, its cessation, which is the third noble truth, repeating that process and solidifying it as the development of the Noble Eightfold Path. And I'm not going to go into all of this stuff in this video. In future videos, I'll go into these things section by section. But without that clarity, which when you have that clarity, when you can see, when your views are no longer views, but they become the viewing through the eyes of Dhamma, through the eyes of the Four Noble Truths, that is breaking of doubt. And that's when you actually enter the stream of Dhamma, because the stream of Dhamma is the functioning of the Noble Eightfold Path within the Four Noble Truths, of course. The Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, they're all kind of layered on top of each other. That's when you actually enter the stream, because then your mind starts to function according to Dhamma. Another thing I wanted to talk about is the Nibbana, Nirvana in Sanskrit, Nibbana in Pali. I generally speak in Pali terms because my personal development has come through Theravada Buddhism without any reference to the Visuddhimagga, only to the suttas. Ajahn Buddhadasa and others have helped me with this. And actually, I just came to this realization today, so it's very fresh. And I waited to record a video to put on YouTube until I really understood this. But Nibbana is not an experience you enter. Nibbana is not a place where you live as an Arahat. It's not the awareness itself. Nibbana is to the things that keep the mind from being awakened, what water is to fire. So the mind under the condition of the defilements, which is greed, hatred, and delusion, is a mind on fire. It is the fire itself. Nibbana is the water. It is the fire extinguisher. So after the fire goes out, it's not the fire extinguisher. It's not the water. It's out. And what's left when the mind makes contact with the Nibbana element, which is the extinguisher, the quenching element, is what Buddhadasa called it. He called Nibbana the quenching element. When the mind makes contact with the quenching element in the same way as the lights being turned on for that child or coming closer to the rope, the fire of the defilements, the ignorance, the craving, and the self that is born of that, they all extinguish together. Now, make no mistake, there are still roots there. So another way I've illustrated this today is that the process is a lot like pulling weeds out. Let's just use one weed as an example. So the roots of the weed are the defilements, the greed, hatred, and aversion. The soil is ignorance, and the stalk is the I in quotes, the letter I, right? And then the fruit is suffering. So the practice is to grasp and rip out the I. And every time you can grasp and rip out the I, you're taking out a little bit of those roots. As long as you're aware that the roots still remain, you won't be fooled into thinking that you're fully awakened when it's so obvious that craving is still there. So those roots, those unwholesome roots of greed, hatred, and aversion are still there. So you have to continuously rip the I out of experience and let nature flow in and as itself. Dhamma is nature, according to Buddhadasa. Dhamma is duty. So basically, the doing of whatever duty there is in this moment, whether it is to put food in this mouth, whether it is to do your job, to care for your child, to care for your wife, to care for your parents, to care for this body, to care for your home, whatever duty is in this moment is actually Dhamma. That is nature. So what you do is you take away the I and you let nature do the duty itself. And that's it. And then you can just feel the flow. At that moment, the mind is making contact with a Nibbana element. It has to be done over and over and over. The fires of greed, hatred, and delusion have to constantly be quenched. The roots have to constantly be taken out until they get weaker and weaker and weaker, and then eventually they no longer remain. And that is the mind of the Arahat, the mind that has no greed, hatred, delusion in it. It has no roots, and because there's no roots, there is no I, and because there's no I, there is no suffering. All that's left is Dhamma. See, the Arahat, or even the stream enterer, does not live in Nibbana. It lives as Dhamma. Dhamma is the path. Dhamma is nature. So all that's left is nature. It just flows all by itself without the invasion of this I. And that is how you can tell if you've had genuine awakening, because what's left after genuine awakening is more and more and more periods of time where there's no I taking hold of the flow of nature. It's just the flow of nature. And when greed, hatred, and delusion no longer arise, all that's left is nature. One last way I'll illustrate this, I call it Dhamma for kids. But it's not for kids. It's actually quite helpful, I think. So the I is the The I is the right? So the sense of self is the Now we're talking linguistics here. So in the seen, there is no suffering. The suffering is in the see The is where the tension is, right? In walking, there's no suffering, but in the walker, there is suffering. In the hearing, there is no suffering, but in the hearer, there is suffering. and so on and so forth. There's no suffering in the flowing of nature. But if there is a flower, there is suffering. In knowing, there's no suffering, but in the knower, there is suffering. In thinking, there is no suffering, but in the thinker, there is suffering. It's the that suffers. It's the that feels this tension in life. It's something that's added to our experience. So if you can make your life just seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, thinking, if you could make the life just experiencing without an experiencer, doing without a doer, knowing without a knower, then there's no suffering. And that could be a practice as well. It's the simplest form of practice. It is simply the flow of nature without a person doing it. And this is a wonderful experience. This is sort of where I arrived today. That made me want to post this video. It's just a state of joyful ease. And anytime that greed, hatred, and aversion arise in the mind, and the knowing is there to see that arising, can throw away the I that comes up from those roots and then rip out the roots, or the other metaphor would be to turn the lights on or to fire the extinguisher, right? Put the fire extinguisher on the fire, throw the water on the fire. Whatever analogy works for the mind. These are all just analogies for true knowledge or wisdom to be applied at the moment of sensory contact. There's however many moments of sense contact every second, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, just blinking in and out of existence. Anytime ignorant, there's a point of contact under the condition of ignorance, a craving will arise and it will give birth to the I who experience. These are different I's, right? When hunger arises, the I arises to go and feed itself, not going to get into all this right now. I really want to end this video on this point here, that the practice really is allowing Dhamma to be Dhamma all by itself, allowing nature to be nature all by itself, to remove the I, to remove the to uproot the craving in its forms of great greed, hatred, and delusion, and just allow the flow to just flow by itself, and just keep doing this over and over and over and over. And over time, these unwholesome roots will cease, and the I and the world and the conflict between the two, time and space, all of the things that are born of craving, born of the I, will all cease together. And what's left is beyond concepts and beyond words. And you don't need to objectify it. You need to simply just be Dhamma, be nature, and Nibbana or Nirvana will arise all by itself. So if you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future videos, please just, like and subscribe and drop a comment. And I plan to make videos that are a little bit more focused on a specific concept. Today was my first. So kind of let the mind go all over the place, just kind of let it flow based off of today's experience. And I hope that what I've said today is of some benefit to whoever's watching this today. So thank you.